before all of that, we're discussing today's headlines with Tom and Sonia. Welcome to both
Hi.
of you. So let's begin with yesterday, shall we? Partygate rumbles on. Boris Johnson gave evidence to MPs investigating whether Parliament was deliberately misled about breaking COVID lockdown rules. During the hearing, Boris Johnson swore with his hand on his heart that he did not lie to the House and said his statements to the Commons were made in good faith. Should we have a little look at what he had to say?
I'm here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time.
Put it to you, Mr. Johnson, you did not take proper advice.
This is complete nonsense. I mean, complete nonsense. I asked the relevant people. They were senior people. They've been working very hard. People who say that we were partying in lockdown simply do not know what they are talking about.
So, what did we make
Who's
of
the
this
we
yesterday?
there? Sorry, but who's the we? Because he wasn't at some of these events, but unless the baby swing or climbing frame was broken by animals and, you know, the booze was procured randomly through, you know, bad actors who happened to go to co-op, they were partying in lockdown. There was no question that parties were held in Downing Street during lockdown.
What's the definition of party?
Well, I think lots of booze with people fornicating and breaking children's swings and getting so drunk that they were throwing up.
I mean, that's a bit more than a party, isn't it?
What kind of parties are you going to,
Yeah,
Tom?
exactly.
It's an old-school house party is what it is.
Wow.
What do you agree?
Well, to be honest, there weren't massive surprises for me. I still watched it, of course. Boris Johnson stuck quite closely to the defence dossier that he released the day before giving evidence. His defence is essentially, I know I made the rules as the Prime Minister. I know I was responsible for communicating the rules to the country. I know I, answered lots of questions from journalists about the rules, but I didn't really understand the rules myself. And because you've got no firm evidence that an advisor told me, written down, clearly this breaks the rules, you can't say that I didn't know that it broke the rules. I mean, that's basically his defence. And regardless of what the Privileges Committee actually end up finding with respect to whether he recklessly misled Parliament or not, I think that just doesn't wash with anyone apart from people who seem to determined to defend Boris Johnson regardless of what he does.
He also pointed out that the fact that the official Downing Street photographer was at these events was sort of, it's implausible that you'd have a photographer there invited if if they were doing anything wrong. But none of these pictures have been released. So somewhere someone said maybe it's best not to put those out.
Yeah, and I mean, he is right to point to, there was a piece in the Times around the time, so some time ago, that did give some detail about the events that happened, some of the events that happened in Downing Street. And there wasn't a lot of fuss made at the time about the fact that there were things going on that seemed in contravention of the guidance. And Johnson relies upon this form of words, in particular the social distancing guidance, of where it is possible, where you can social distance where possible. And his argument is, well, we were having a leaving drinks. We were in Downing Street, which is, small and compact, so it wasn't going to be possible for us to social distance at a leaving drinks. And he even said that he would have stood at the podium of number 10 and told the country that during lockdown it would have been within the rules to have had leaving drinks at work.
Wow.
It would have been within the guidance. It's a farce.
Yeah,
it's
it is.
Farce.
It's a total farce. Everyone knows. I mean, any layperson would look at those rules and think, right, we're not allowed to have leaving drinks at work. And Johnson's argument was, well, it was essential. It was essential to thank my staff.
What idiots
and
we are.
I just think that that's so galling. If you're a nurse who worked all hours under the sun in the most terrible conditions in a hospital for the NHS, you weren't having leaving parties.
It was interesting because on GMB this morning they were talking about Sarah Gilbert and her team and when they created the vaccine and that moment when they realised that they'd got this vaccine and this was going to literally save the day.
Yeah.
And in order to celebrate that, there were champagne glasses put on a table one by one. They left their desks, went and got one glass, went back to their desks where they all joined Zoom to toast one another. So they found a way. I mean, what a contrast that is.
Quite. I mean, I think they're going to struggle with the intentionally misled. because it's quite hard to prove what was in his head. I think the recklessly misled Parliament, I think, is where they're clearly aiming and could still theoretically end up with Boris Johnson losing his seat.
Well, the front page of the Metro has been getting a lot of attention for the placement of a Burger King ad. There's no smoke without fire. You know,
I think it's a big whopper.
Love it. Yeah, it's a whopper.
So with
I mean, that is a
underneath,
genius bit of
very clever
advertising.
placement from the paper and
They've
Burger
done
King
well.
as well.
They've made, I think no one's got any qualm or misunderstanding about where the Metro is coming from on this.
Where do we actually think this will go? What does his career look like now?
Well, so there's always been a small coterie of Conservative MPs who want him to make a comeback. I've never thought that that's possible or on the cards, really. I think most of them know that Boris Johnson has gone from being a big electoral asset to somebody quite toxic with a lot of voters. So I don't think that was ever on the cards. I think the interesting thing is really what happens to his parliamentary career now. So the Privileges Committee, it's their job to come up with recommendations if they found that he recklessly or intentionally misled Parliament, and then MPs have to vote on those recommendations. If they recommend a suspension from the Commons of more than 10 days, then that automatically triggers a recall petition, which, if more than 1 in 10 voters in Boris Johnson's constituency sign, means that you would see a by-election. So that's why Tom said he could even lose a seat as a result of this.
Weirdly, I think it might be in his interests ultimately for that to happen.
Really?
Why?
Oh,
Because
explain that.
I get the membership, the Conservative Party membership, love the guy. They still love him. That's why you're seeing deselection of some anti-Boris MPs around the country. And I think it would act as a spur to get the parliamentary, his supporters in the parliamentary party and those in the membership who like him, to find him the safest possible seat anywhere else around the country. Put him in where there's a majority of something like 20,000 that he can't possibly lose at the next election. And so it propels the idea of Boris Johnson still in the shadows with the potential of coming back through again should the Tories lose the next election. I don't see it as... Wow. I'm afraid I don't see it as the end. I think this is a permanent Boris Johnson show.
I just can't see him ever being leader of the Conservative Party again or
I
this
agree.
again. But I do think that the ghost of Boris Johnson is going to continue to haunt Conservative
always
Party
there.
leaders for quite some time. Even if he's not in Parliament, he will be carping from the sidelines.
If you're talking about ghosts, the ghost children of the pandemic. A report found that 140,000 children were severely absent from school last summer. Severe absence means that children are spending more time out of school than in school. It warned that children are at risk of disengaging with education entirely. Suggestion that since lockdown routines haven't been re-established, parents are more willing to let children have time off school. Parents are working from home, so you're home, so why can't I be? That this is another effect of the pandemic.
I mean, this is really serious. It's something that the government's really worried about. It's something that MPs are really worried about. MPs in the Commons have just launched a new inquiry into what's going on with absences in schools. It's huge. It makes a massive difference for a child's education. There's a measure called persistent absence, which is missing sort of 10% of school days throughout the year. That's bad enough. Severe absence is a new measure that the government have come up with post-pandemic because they're so worried about it's still a very small proportion of children, but it's gone up. Missing more than 50% of school, that is going to have huge impacts for you as a child in terms of your long-term prospects. So it's clearly something to do with the pandemic because it's already happening, but it's gone up. But, we have to disentangle what it is. I think some of it will be cultural, parents working from home, some suggestion that some parents sort of have started keeping their kids home from school on Fridays. I think there's a lot of anxiety out there. There is sort of a shift in attitudes. We did this from home for a bit. I think some kids just kind of got turned off school altogether. But it's really serious, and it's kids from poorer backgrounds who are missing most school, and that's really significant.
In the disentangling of what's going on here, it would be quite easy to reach for they're feckless parents who can't be bothered to send their children to school. It'd be quite easy to reach for that. And I just wonder, given how much it's gone up by and the persistence of the absence, I wonder whether the effect of lockdown, particularly on mental health, is having a big impact here. And the inability of access to particularly children's mental health services, I wonder whether that is a big factor. Yeah. But I do think if homeschooling is the response for some mum and dads, and maybe it works for some children, there needs to be better oversight of what's actually being taught at home, who's doing the teaching, how often. There is no register of homeschooling that needs to happen.
And we don't even know whether these kids are being homeschooled. I mean, some of them are just going to be missing out on their education.
Well, let's leave that there for now. We'll come back to you.